It's been said that every quilt tells a story, and it's so true. But I also believe every quilter has a story to tell. I wanted to hear about the people behind these wonderful quilts and thought you'd enjoy hearing about their lives also. Welcome to A Quilter's Life. I see Sara Browne and her cousins as heroes. When COVID and the lockdown began, she could have just looked after herself, but she reached out to others to lift them up. She continues to add value to people's lives, even after the lockdown has ended. She sees herself as an enabler by helping people learn the parts they don't know how to do for themselves. You might find yourself looking at the sky in a different way after this interview with Sara. There is color all around us if we look for it. You'll want to look at Sara's episode page on my website, A Quilter's Life, to see her beautiful quilts that we talked about in this interview. Sara, I am so excited that you are joining us on A Quilter's Life today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, Helen Pritchett connected us. How do you know Helen?
Helen moved into East Haddon, which is the village where I live, about a year ago. She's been living locally for a long time, but I hadn't met her before. And she was looking for a sewing class. And she saw that I was doing a sewing class and she came and joined. And we've stitched together. We've become great friends. And we also sometimes walk our dogs together.
So she lives fairly close to you?
Within 5 minutes.
Wonderful. Share where you were born and raised.
I was born in Croydon, which is a suburb of South London, and I was one of 4 children. My parents were very much focusing on us being at home. My mother was a stay-at-home mum. My father was an engineer. He travelled all over the world with his job. And in those days, there was no mobile phones or anything. So often he would go off to either Poland or wherever he was going. And we wouldn't hear from him for a couple of weeks. And then he would phone my mother from Heathrow Airport to say, I'm just coming home. And she would look after us while he was away. And then when I was 9 or 10, we moved up to Liverpool. And then after that, we moved to Lincoln. And then we moved to Suffolk. And then we moved to Norfolk. And then back to Suffolk. And then by that time, I bought my own house.
Please share a childhood memory.
When I was about 4, I was rising 5. That Christmas, I managed to get hold of the Quality Street tin. So it's a big chocolate tin containing a couple of kilos of chocolates, which we always had. We weren't allowed to open it until Christmas Eve. And my mother found me after Christmas tipping the chocolates out on the dining room floor and taking the tin because I wanted to keep the tin for all my sewing things. And I managed to purloin little pairs of scissors, sewing thread, bits of fabric, whatever I could get my hands on. And I kept them all in that tin under my bed for a long time. The second memory I have, which is a really strong childhood memory, was when I was 10, we just moved up to a place called Ormskirk near Liverpool. And I had been given a book token for Christmas. And I knew exactly what I wanted to buy with that book token. What my father didn't know was that I'd been looking at this book in the local bookstore for weeks, probably months. And there was no way was I going to be able to save that amount of money. But the book token was the right amount of money. So as soon as the store was open again after Christmas, I went in with my book token and I bought McCall's Needlework in Colour at the age of 10. And to this day, I still have this book and I still use it actually. But I've also learned so much from it. I learned to knit from it. I learned to do so many crafting skills. And it's such a well-written book. The pictures are good. So whether you're a visual learner or a reading learner, it doesn't matter. That book will still be good for you. And I can remember the feeling of pure joy walking out of W.H. Smith's in Ormskirk with this book under my arm. And I still love that book. It is held together with tape, by the way.
How did you know that book was at that store?
It was in the shop window. And every day on the way to school, we got driven to school, I'd look out of the car window and see that book, and it was still there, and it was still there, and it was still there. I knew that book was mine, and I actually had the one out of the shop window. It was my book.
I bet that shop owner enjoyed selling that to you. Over the years, did you have other employment besides quilting?
Yes. Well, I started off, I did a secretarial course after I left school because I couldn't decide what to do. And I went to work at Charing Cross Hospital. Somehow or other, I contracted hepatitis and I was ill for quite a long time and I didn't work. So I went back to Suffolk, and then I sort of wandered into the legal profession. And looking back, it really wasn't the right place for me. I mean, it was good at the time. It was a way to earn a living. But had I not been in the legal profession, I would not have met my husband. He's a corporate lawyer and works very long hours. So I can be the support act at home and do my sewing.
Right place, right time.
Absolutely.
And where are you living now, and how did you get there from where you were born and raised?
I met my husband at work in Norwich, and he came over to Northampton 28 years ago. And I followed pretty sharpish after that. But I was commuting between here and Norwich for my job in Norwich. And that's about a 3-hour journey each way. And coming home from Norwich one Thursday night, I had a car accident. I hit a deer on the notorious A11, and it broke my car off, and it did quite a lot of damage to my back and my teeth. But I got out alive. And my husband said to me, "You don't need to go back to the law," once we'd got me sorted out. And that sorting out involved quite a lot of surgery. I've got 2 spinal fusions. But then he said to me, what do you really want to do? I said, I want to teach sewing. That's how this business where I am now started. I'd always sewn. I'd made wedding dresses. I'd made curtains. I've got myself qualified as a professional curtain maker. I'd done an interior design diploma. But it was the engagement with people for me that was key. And it was having people coming in and being shown how they could sew. Because a lot of people come into classes at the beginning and they think they can't, or there's a big block somewhere in their psyche. They think that they're not good enough or their work's not good enough. And what I see my role as just being the enabler to skill people and to help them over the bits they can't do themselves. But we now live in a village called East Haddon, which is almost the central point of England. We're as far away from the sea as you can possibly be. It's on the network of canals. We're very close to the Grand Union Canal. And the canal system was basically the motorway system of the 17th century. It's the way everything got transported around, whether it was stone or coal or animals or food, whatever it was always on the canals and the rivers. And my niece actually lives on a broad beam barge, which I think used to be a coal moving barge in Oxford.
So people are still living on the canals.
Yes, there's a lot of community living on the canals. If you go and look at any of the bridges that go over any of the little inlets or the smaller canals, there's always 2 or 3 barges there. Some people use them just at weekends or for hobbies, but there's a lot of people actually live on the rivers and the canals. And there's also one of the ladies who comes to my sewing classes. She works voluntarily on the ladder of locks. So a ladder of locks is when there's a series of them. So you've got a steep hill and you've got to get the boats up the hill. So you have a series of locks, and she works there as a volunteer, getting boats up and down. That's all within 20 minutes of here. Also not very far from here is Althorpe, which is where Princess Diana is buried and where she grew up. But there's also another house called Holdenby House. That is literally just 2 miles from here. That was the house where Charles I was imprisoned before he was taken back to London in the 1600s before he was executed. And a lot of the English Civil War was around here. So there's a lot of Civil War history around here. We are as far from the sea as you can be in England, in a village about 5 miles from here called Weedon. There is an old ammunition store, I think it was in the 1800s, where the ammunition was kept because it meant invaders couldn't get to it because it was an awfully long way. Now we've got the big motorway called the A14, which takes you over to the east coast. But if you want to go to the west coast, you have to go up the M1 and then across the M6, and it's a lot further. But when those roads didn't exist and you were basically going down mud tracks, they'd have never got there. But again, there is a canal that goes into where the ammunition store is, and that is all part of the Grand Union Canal.
It's such neat information. Thanks. Was there anything else about your family you wanted to share?
I have a very large family. We don't have any children, but I have a large number of nephews and nieces and great nephews and nieces. Don't ask me to choose my favourite because there isn't one. My husband has a smaller family, and one of his nieces has just had a little boy called Rory. And my nephew Christopher has just had a little boy. He's also called Rory, so I can see that's going to cause confusion in years to come. There's 3 months between them. My side of the family, I'm one of 4, and they've got lots of children between them. And those children have now got their own children. So family events are always great fun.
Well, thinking about those generations coming along, how do you think maybe these 2 little Rorys will describe you in generations to come?
I would imagine they'll probably say, oh, Auntie Sarah, she's the one who had all those chickens and she used to make quilts and make us things. I hope they will have happy memories of coming here because we're very close to beautiful countryside. To get onto a huge playing field and then into the fields, we don't actually have to go in the car. I walk the dog every day down our drive, a few yards along the road, up a path which goes up to the big playing field, and then I can let Ruby off and she can run around with all her little friends up there. And that's where I meet Helen.
Nice. Well, I got to see that Ruby is a Brittany Spaniel.
Yeah, Ruby is a Brittany Spaniel. For 14 years, I had a magnificent cat. His name was Haggis. And he was 7.5 kilos of complete thug. He died when he was 14, and I couldn't bear the thought of having another cat in the house. So we decided we'd get a dog, and we took on a rescue dog. We contacted SOS Spaniels. I was told by many, many people that it will take a long time for you to get a rescue dog. Dogs that need to be solo dogs are rare. So I thought I'll fill in the form, submit it. That was at 10 o'clock that night. At 9 o'clock the following morning, I had a phone call from the charity and they said, we think we've got a dog that would suit you. So we went over and met Ruby, at which point we had absolutely no idea that this dog is celiac, so her diet is very limited. But also I have had to learn an awful lot about the effect of the moon because Ruby is affected by full moon. And I know this sounds bonkers, but she goes nuts. She'll walk around the house all night. She won't eat. She will eat. She'll wake me up. It's just unbelievable. And we've got full moon in 2 nights' time. And that's why she's so restless at the moment. As the moon comes up, she will become more restless as the night proceeds. As soon as full moon is over and the moon starts waning, she settles down again. But because she has this, it's a real affliction I'm pretty certain to some extent it's because the dogs are so poorly looked after in Spain, which is where she comes from. She came from 100 just north of Valencia, and they are very cruel to their dogs. And it's taken us a long time to get her settled. She doesn't like going in the car, but we are blessed with a fantastic dog sitter. So we are now starting to be able to go away on holiday. Sadly, we can't take her with us because she just wouldn't enjoy it, which would mean that we wouldn't enjoy it either. She's a very kind, gentle soul, but she doesn't like delivery men very much. So if we've got the Amazon delivery man coming, she does tend to have a little bit of a growl and a bark at them. She wouldn't bite anybody. I know every dog owner says this, but Ruby really wouldn't. She would run away rather than bite anybody. We got her on the 15th of February 2020, and she's now 9. So we got her just before COVID struck. She's what you would expect a rescue dog from those circumstances to be. She's got a lot of baggage, and it's been very hard work. To start off with, we were just told it was anxiety. It's a history of her, the fact that she was a rescue dog that had been dumped or was going to be shot or whatever they were going to do with her, and the abuse that she'd received along the way. And I kept a diary of what was going on and her tummy and everything else. And we went to the Willow Clinic in Birmingham, which is a wonderful pet resource in this country. We saw a vet called James, and I gave him the diary. And he said, I think this is anxiety. I'm pretty certain this is anxiety. He said, I'm going to go and think about this and I'll call you in a couple of days. Well, he called me in the middle of my Friday sewing class. So I went out of the pavilion and talked to him. And he said, I think her anxiety is caused by her tummy ache. There is a blood test I want to have done, which will prove it one way or another. We had the blood test done, and lo and behold, yes, she is celiac. And that is a bigger problem than perhaps you realise, because you think, well, I don't give my dog bread, I don't give my dog biscuits. If we give Ruby chicken meat and that chicken has been fed on grain, she will react to that gluten and she will be ill. That's how sensitive she is. But we manage it well and we get through it, and she's fine, and she's sleeping on the sofa next to me now. And thankfully she stopped snoring because it was loud.
I didn't hear it at all. Pets can be such a comfort to us. I'm glad you have her.
I also have 9 chickens. My husband is wondering how on earth we've gone from 3 chickens to 9. And I just keep telling him it's chicken maths. This year, my lovely old girl, Flora, she was a white, light Sussex hen. She was 8, she died. And I thought, well, I'll get another hen to fill the gap. And when I went to collect them from the chicken breeder, he got 4 in the box and he said, oh, you can choose which one you want. And I said to him, I'm not taking a chicken out of a box in the middle of a car park. I'll take the lot. So I came home with 4 chickens. So I'd already got 4, and an old one, Cinders, is, I think she's 8, coming up 9 now. She was the last chicken of a flock that lived in London. And my niece Rowena rang me and said, Auntie Sarah, my friend's got this one chicken. Can you take it on? So we were having a family party. So Rowena turned up with this live chicken. So she is now head of the hen run. She has a wonderful life. She's laid 2 eggs in the time she's been here. Other than that, she's just wanders around digging holes, eating worms, and having a lovely life. It's very nice to see how she's settled, because to start off with, she didn't settle. I had to keep her separate from the other chickens for 2 weeks in a completely separate run, which I always do when I'm introducing new chickens anyway. You keep them separate so you can make sure there are no cross diseases being brought in or being transferred to the new chickens. And it gives you a chance to get to know the new ones. They get used to being handled, because all my chickens I can pick up and basically walk around the garden with them under my arm. And they are great therapy. I think chickens should be on prescription, so that if you have any sort of anxiety, If you've got chickens up the end of your garden that you can go and talk to at any time, and you can tell them anything, and you can shout at them or whisper at them or whatever, and they just look at you, cluck, and then go and lay an egg. Does it get any better?
It sure doesn't. Besides quilting, are there other crafts that you have done or that you do?
I got qualified as a professional curtain maker, and I also did an interior design diploma. For a while, I was making curtains, hand-stitched interline curtains, which is time intensive. They're not the sort of curtains that you buy from the store. I also done a bit of tapestry, a bit of embroidery, but I love knitting Aran sweaters. The more complicated the pattern, the better. It's a tradition from one of the Scottish islands, the Isle of Arran. It's not to be confused with Fair Isle. Aran sweaters are all knitted from the same coloured wool, and you've got cables and knobbles and twists and turns, and to make a hard-wearing sweater. It's getting more and more difficult to get decent quality knitting wool because everybody seems to be producing this polyester rubbish, which I don't like knitting with.
How do you spell Aran?
A-R-A-N.
Okay. They sound so interesting. I want to make sure I know where I can look them up. We talked about the chickens. Do you have other hobbies?
I love cooking. I love making good quality food from scratch. And we also have a vegetable patch in the garden, which I share with the man who helps us in the garden. So we share the produce because it does produce a lot. This year we've got raspberries, rhubarb, potatoes, broad beans, runner beans, beetroot, black lettuce, which tastes fabulous. We've got gooseberries, black currants, Bramley apple tree, which is loaded, an eating apple tree, which is loaded with fruit. And then best of all, we have a mirabelle tree. The mirabelles are like tiny plums, but they're orange in colour. Some of them are speckled with red freckles. And they are beautifully sweet, slightly tart. They're a cross between a plum and an apricot, I think, really. But you sometimes also get a hint of a flavour of gooseberry. One thing I love to do, if the crop hasn't been destroyed by the weather, which frequently it does get caught, I like to make mirabelle conserve. So you have, say, 2 kilos of stoned mirabelles, 2 kilos of sugar. You let the juice from the fruit macerate the sugar. So you don't take the skin off the mirabelles. You just put the halved fruit in with the sugar and a split open vanilla pod. Stir it round until all the sugar is dissolved. It takes probably about 12 hours to do that properly. And then it takes 20 minutes to cook. And there you are. You've got conserve for the whole family for Christmas. We also make chutney using the apples and other goodies from the garden. And I do like making cakes. My husband was always asking me to make lemon drizzle cake to take into the office. And that all seems to go down well. But when I do my sewing classes, when we do an all-day class, I always take a cake in. That always goes down well too.
That sounds delicious. I want to jump back to the chickens for one more minute. Do you get eggs from your chickens?
We do get eggs from our chickens. I've got 4 who are laying now, and I've got 4 who are just about coming on to lay. So at the moment, we get 6 or 7 eggs a day. But the reason I started to keep chickens was because for very many years, I just couldn't eat eggs, couldn't eat pancakes, egg mayonnaise sandwiches, which I love. I just could not eat them. I just always got a tummy ache. This was going back a long time now. I was in the dentist waiting for my appointment, and there was a magazine there called Farmers Weekly, which is a well-known publication in this country. Usually the only place I ever read it or see it is the dentist. But on this particular occasion, there was an article all about keeping chickens and how farmers were keeping chickens healthy, even though they were quite intensively farmed. And there, in the middle of the article, was a list of all the drugs and antibiotics that were being fed to chickens at that time. And on that list were 5 which I was allergic to. So by having chickens in my garden, I can eat eggs. And we don't eat all the eggs my hens lay. So if I've got 8 chickens laying and they lay 6 eggs a week each, that's 48 eggs a week. So the man who helps us in the garden, he has some, and then I sell the rest, and that pays for their bedding and their food. They live a luxurious life, my chickens. At the moment, they are wandering around the garden, digging up anything they can find. They keep us free of slugs, and they're just very happy souls. And I've got one in particular. She's a sweet soul. She's always the first out of the hen run. She always comes and has a chat with me. But she likes to sit on my right foot, on my Wellington boot, when I'm walking up the garden, just because she likes having the ride. But she's also one that likes to be picked up. She always wants to be picked up and come and have a chat with me, and I'll take her with me, whatever I'm doing. So they have a grand life, my chickens. When their time comes, we make sure they don't suffer.
It's so cool to see their personalities. We don't necessarily think of chickens having personalities, but from what you've said, they do.
They all have personalities. I've got one of the younger 4. She has to shout all the time. She just shouts. And if I walk away from her, she shouts even louder. But they are easy to tell apart. I mean, if I've got 100, I doubt whether I could tell them all apart. But certainly having 9, you can tell them apart, even though 8 of them are all brown hens.
Yeah. Sara, do you think any of your hobbies or other crafts show up in your quilting?
I think yes, because one of the things I learned when I was doing my interior design course was how to use the colour wheel and what the colours, how you can blend. But more than that, we have a collection of paintings here in this house. They're a mixed bunch. Some are by a Norfolk artist called H.J. Jackson. He does lino prints, and he is basically the world master of lino printing. But there is another artist we've got some paintings from. He's a Suffolk artist called Matthew Garrett, and he uses the most vibrant colours in his pictures. I can remember I was standing in a shop in Southwold in Suffolk, debating whether to buy this other picture. Did I really need to buy another Matthew Garrett picture? And I was thinking out loud because I said, I wonder how he gets to use these colours that he uses, because they're always the vibrant end of the colour scale. And this hand clamped on my shoulder, and this gentleman said, follow me out onto the street and I will show you. It was Matthew Garrett himself. It was a Saturday afternoon in November. The sun was setting and it was a brilliant, brilliant colour in the sky. And he said, I want you to tell me what colours you see. What are the colours you see? Don't tell me what your eyes are telling your brain. Look and see what colours you are seeing. And I said, oh, it's a red sky at night. He said, no, that's not the question. What colours do you see? And I suddenly clicked what he was talking about. And I could see purple and orange and blue and red and green and turquoise. And I had made my brain see the colours my eyes were seeing. And he made me stop and think and look. And often I'll look at the sky, which you think is a grey sky, and it won't be grey. It'll have every shade of grey, every shade of blue and white and cream up there. And it was Matthew Garrett that taught me to see. And he's an incredibly talented artist, but he does use some crazy colours.
What a wonderful gift he gave you that day to share that with you.
It was a gift.
Who introduced you to quilting?
I was introduced to quilting by a book called McCall's Needlework in Colour. That was where I started. I was already sewing. I'd started sewing almost as soon as I could walk. But when I got that book, there was so much in there that intrigued me. And that's when I really started quilting.
I'm curious, did you see quilts at home or quilts around, or was it in that book that you first saw a
It was only
quilt?
that book. It was only in that book because we didn't have a TV either at home when I was little, and we were encouraged to read a lot. I can't recall when I saw my first quilt, but the McCall needlework in colour is the one that I remember started the whole journey of thinking about it. And I think I'd stitched for a long time before I got completely absorbed by how much wastage was going on in fabrics. When I started my sewing classes, this was after I'd had a car accident and I couldn't go back to working in the legal profession. My husband said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to teach sewing." And he said, "Well, just go and do it." So I rent the local sports pavilion and I was running classes, and I got people coming into the class on a Wednesday evening. And at the end of every class, I was horrified at the amount of waste fabric people were just putting in the bin as they were walking out. So as soon as the door was shut, I was taking it out again. I started stitching string blocks with the scraps from the bin. And when I got it to the point where the top was pieced, I left it on the table in the sewing class and didn't say anything. And people were walking past and going, "Oh, there's my fabric. Oh, there's a bit more of my fabric. Oh, there's more of my fabric." And they suddenly realised, and it's amazing, having seen that quilt top, the amount of wastage reduced substantially.
So do you take that quilt to other classes so people can see that?
If we're doing an exhibition or anything like that, because sometimes I get asked to do a display, I'll take that quilt along as the one that really got me into thinking about not just buying fabric, but using scraps and not wasting more than you absolutely have to. And I was in a class on Friday and a lady came in and she said, "I want to make a cushion for my garden chair." And she produced a piece of fabric that she had bought from a fabric sale I'd run a couple of years ago. And that fabric had been donated by another lady into the class. Somebody else had made some cushions or zippy bags or something with it. What was left over was all bundled up and put into the fabric sale. This lady had bought it, brought it into the class. She's made another cushion for her garden with it. I think people get a bit obsessed with everything having to match all the time. And in my garden, we have a large basket of cushions for the garden chairs or the garden furniture. And if a nice piece of suitable fabric appears on my doorstep, I will make another cushion for the garden with it. There's a whole hodgepodge mix of it. But it was really quite amazing how making that one quilt changed things and how people have got more and more into using scraps.
Yeah. And it's beautiful. Whether it's a quilt you made or a quilt you saw somewhere else, do you have a favorite quilt or quilt pattern?
No, I don't. I don't particularly like super complicated, but I started the Lockdown Patchwork Project in March 2020 when I had to cancel all my sewing classes because of COVID. I was very worried about how people were going to cope because I knew there were several people who came to classes. It was their release. They came and they enjoyed the getting together with other stitchers. And we have those wonderful conversations when you're in a sewing group where everybody's looking at what they're doing. It's like the conversations you have in the car. You're not looking at each other, but you have those heart-to-heart conversations. And that happens all the time in sewing classes. So I thought I'll teach people how to quilt from the very beginning. We'll start with a 4-patch. I'd never done anything like this before in my life. So I wrote the instructions. I published them. The ladies concerned started stitching. That was on a Wednesday. On the Friday evening, it was about 8 o'clock at night. We were 3 days into the first lockdown at that point, and my husband and I were sitting in the living room, and all of a sudden my laptop started pinging. And it was 38 people from goodness knows where had asked to join what we were then calling the Lockdown Patchwork Project. And I got in a bit of a fizz about it, and I thought, I can't cope with 38 people. That's ridiculous. I'll never cope with 38 people. By the time I got up on Saturday morning, it was another 500 had joined us. At which point, my lovely cousin, Alison, who lives in France, messaged me, said, "Cuz, you're never going to cope with this. I'll come and join you." And she's a brilliant quilter, very clever stitcher. She's also a retired engineer. She likes designing quilts. And then my cousin Jenny in Australia contacted us and said, "I'll come and help with the admin." And Jenny is very good at spotting a potential troll who tries to get into the group. So there were 3 of us, and I was working on the basis that, as they say, a 3-legged stool never wobbles, that we would be okay. So I was writing block instructions, and Alison was helping me with that. So our instructions are all written, and then they've got a series of photographs with them. And then we've actually got photographs in the Lockdown Patchwork Project of other people's versions of these blocks. But then we started designing quilts. Alison's a very whizzo designer, and she's designed quite a few quilts. I think I've sent you a few copies. There's one with the red barns on. That's our barnstorming quilt. There's another one you've got there, a photograph of, which is a blue and white. That is our scrappy jewel quilt. That is a very complicated pattern, but there are no curves in it. It's all straight lines. The pattern that I am proudest of at this point, for me personally, is our scrappy confetti quilt, because this is designed for beginners. This is for total beginners, and it uses the block instructions that we've got in the Lockdown Patchwork Project. This last week, we've just finished our latest sew-along version of it. So we do it over 10, 11 weeks, so people can stitch along. I've used this quilt pattern in classes, and I have seen people go from a complete novice, I can't do this, don't show me the finished quilt because I'll never be able to do it, to being really confident quilters. I'm so proud of what Alison and I have done with this quilt pattern, because it's given so many people the confidence to go on and try patterns that they may not be the ones that we're teaching. They may go elsewhere for them. That doesn't matter. What matters is that they are learning to stitch and quilt, and they're getting the cathartic effect of stitching and using materials and enjoying the threads and just the whole process of piecing a block, getting the frustration of not getting your corners right, not cutting right, learning how to use a rotary cutter properly, all those things, they're all important. But everybody I know who's made the scrappy confetti quilt has come out the other end able to move on to much more complicated things. And it's almost a gateway version into quilting. And it also uses a huge amount of scrap, which is a great way of using up the fabrics. But going back to the Lockdown Patchwork Project, when that started, when we got to about, I think it was 590 people, I thought, well, that's going to be it. It didn't. It kept on growing, kept on growing, kept on growing. It was a daily, joyful meeting of people who were all stuck at home. But then I started getting messages from people who were not necessarily in a position to stitch. And there was one lady in particular, she was an elderly lady, somewhere in Central America. She was living in a high-rise flat with her husband who got dementia. She was having to look after him on her own. They were locked down. She couldn't get out very much with him. And she messaged me and we started chatting. And she said that she dealt with her husband while he was awake during the day. And then when he'd had his night medication and gone to sleep, she would come on to the Lockdown Patchwork Project and she would read everybody's posts and look at what everybody had been doing. And she said it kept her sane. We had endless messages like that from people all over the world. Then one of the ladies messaged me to say that Toledo Museum were running a virtual quilt display, and they wanted people to send in contributions to this virtual quilt exhibition they were going to put on. This was chatted about in the Lockdown Patchwork Project, and I messaged the director and I said, will you accept blocks from the UK and elsewhere around the world? And he said, well, it's supposed to be a USA project to start off with, because we've got enough people in this country to provide the blocks we need. When the virtual exhibition went live, he had accepted all the 21 blocks that had been sent in by various people, including from one lady who had sent in a photograph of her first ever 4-patch. Now, that lady has gone on to be a very competent quilter, but the boost that gave to her was absolutely amazing. We were a year in and we were still dealing with lockdowns and all that other stuff that we were having to cope with. The isolation, not seeing families, not being able to do classes, not being able to get fabrics because the fabric stores were all sold out because everybody was buying fabric to make masks. People were also having big clear outs. So I would regularly come down and find that somebody overnight sneaked a bag of fabric onto our porch. And there was one morning when I came downstairs and my husband opened the front door and he said, this has got to be for you. And there were 8 dustbin bags full of fabric that somebody had just dumped in our porch. And I thought, what on earth am I going to do with all this fabric? So I was the one who was driving around Northamptonshire, leaving bags of fabric in telephone boxes on street corners and then messaging people to tell them where it was so they could get hold of fabrics. And that was great fun. But there was also one suitcase which I filled up with fabric, passed it on to a lady down the road from me. She took out what she wanted, put in what she didn't want, passed it on to somebody else. We still have no idea where this suitcase has got to, but we know we must have kept a lot of people going, just circulating all that fabric. And then I was contacted by the Quebec Quilters Guild, and they were looking for people to do online presentations, basically to keep people occupied and busy. And they asked me whether I would do a presentation about the Lockdown Patchwork Project, what it's all about, where we got to, how it had started. And I blog a bit on the Lockdown Patchwork Project as well. And she wanted to know about Northamptonshire and the canals and the history of the Civil War and all sorts of stuff like that. I'm not quite sure, but I had a lot of help from a couple of friends who are very good at doing these presentations. And I put together a slideshow and did an hour's presentation to Quebec's Quilters Guild. They recorded it and it's now on YouTube on the Lockdown Patchwork Project, which I find absolutely hilarious. We've got a few more videos on the Lockdown Patchwork YouTube channel as well. And then when everything got back to sort of normal and we started being able to do classes again, I thought the Lockdown Patchwork Project would die. And it hasn't. It's still keeping going. As I said, we've just finished our most recent sew-along, and that was Scrappy Confetti, which we'd repeated. And I've got various other treats up my sleeve, which I'm not going to reveal now, but we're about to do a couple more videos of things I've made and worked out unique patterns for. Unfortunately, Alison has been very poorly, so she's been out of action for several months. So I've just been keeping going, and she'll come back when she's good and ready. But without her and Jenny, the Lockdown Project would have sunk without trace, because there's no way I could have dealt with the sheer volume of questions we got on a daily basis. And I always remember we were 2 or 3 weeks in to the first lockdown, and my husband came in and he said, you have to get off that laptop. You can't spend the whole of the lockdown on that laptop, because he was aware just how long it was taking me to do everything. But I'd do it all again in a heartbeat.
You kept a lot of people going.
It kept me going too.
When you're working on your quilts, Is there a tool that you use that when you use it, you're thinking, I am so glad someone made this tool?
Yes, it's my unpicker. I have got a beautiful unpicker made from Japanese steel. The blade is Japanese steel. And during lockdown, there's a craftsman down in Cornwall who makes these all hand turned. A lot of people bought them, but I've got the one which has got the Japanese steel unpicker, and it's also got a stiletto at the other end. I struggle to use any other unpicker now because this one is the right weight for my hand. The other thing I have is a pair of, obviously I use a rotary cutter, but I've also got a very beautiful pair of stainless steel scissors that my mother gave to me when I was 14. And they are fearsome. Even after all these years, they're still fearsome. And no, they are not used for cutting paper, cable ties, wire netting, or anything else.
People that don't sew just don't understand why we don't want them to use them.
There's a lot of controversy about, well, it's only a pair of scissors. No, it's not. They're my scissors. I think a lot of people don't understand that paper blunts scissors very quickly. I've got an old blade that I use in my rotary cutter if I'm cutting paper. So if I'm making a pattern and I need to use my rotary cutter, I'll put the old blade in it. And that will go on for, I think it's the same blade I've had for several years, but it's useless at cutting fabric.
Yeah. It still amazes me how many steps we have in the quilting process. Do you like each step along the way, or do you look forward to a specific step?
I think every step in the whole process, from sitting with a pile of fabrics and deciding what goes with what pattern you're going to use, whether you got a piece of fabric that you particularly always want to get into your quilts. They all have their place and they've all got different skills. And a lot of people seem to think that once you've pieced your quilt top, that's it. And it's not. The quilting and the actual construction of the layered sandwich can take as long as actual piecing itself. A friend of mine, Angie Atwood, you may have heard of her. She teaches westerly ruler quilting and she's done a few workshops at East Haddon. We have a jolly band of ladies who come to my classes who are now being taught by Angie how to ruler quilt. And obviously that's quite a dense form of quilting, not for everybody. And the intensity of the skill and the time you have to spend to learn ruler quilting is not for everybody. But for those who have taken to it, it's made the craft even more fun because, yes, they enjoyed the piecing bit and making the top. But having got it layered, they don't always want to just do straight line quilting because, let's face it, quilting itself is fundamentally the stitches that hold the layers together so that the quilt will last, so that you've read the instructions that come with your wadding, so that you know you mustn't do your stitching lines any further apart than 4 inches, 6 inches, 8 inches, or 10 inches, whatever the instructions tell you, so that your wadding has a sufficient network of stitching to stay in place. When you get into ruler quilting, that's when it becomes a specialist art form. And I have to say, Angie Atwood, she is the master in my view. She's brilliant at it. She's also an incredibly good teacher. There was one particular class I remember we had a little earlier in the year. She was showing people what they were going to do. She said, by the end of today, this is what you will be quilting. There were snorts of laughter and you've got to be joking, I can't do that. And she got every single person in that room stitching all those block designs that she'd come up with. The confidence that gives people doesn't stay just in quilting. It goes over into all sorts of parts of their lives because a lot of people come into a sewing class thinking, I can't do this, or I'm no good at that, or she's better than me, or I'll never achieve that. There's huge amounts of negativity. And what I absolutely adore is when you've got somebody who comes in that frame of mind, and I can just little bit by little bit chip away at that negativity. And the way I start all the people who come into my sewing classes is that they make a zippy bag. And they always go home from the end of their first 2.5-hour session with a zippy bag with a proper zip in it that they have made themselves. They've done the cutting. And then you say to them, well, actually, how many lines of stitching do you think is contained in this zippy bag? This is before you start. And they'll go, oh, I don't know, probably 10 or 15. And then at the end of it, you say to them, do you realise there's actually 5, maybe 6 lines of stitching involved in making a zippy bag? That includes all the zip ends and everything. The confidence which that imbibes them with, and in which they come into the next class, if I could bottle it, I'd be rich. Because it really does make the difference. To see people's confidence grow and tackle things that perhaps they wouldn't have previously dreamed of, that for me is the magic. And then, of course, you get to the point where you give somebody a quilt. I recently made a quilt for my nephew for his wedding. That's the one with all the flying geese on, the green one. And I made that for his wedding. And I've actually finished burying all the ends on the morning of the wedding, just before we drove off. And I kept scraps of that in a bag, and I have no idea why I did. But I have just made a quilt for his son, Rory too, using a lot of the scraps, leftover fabric from his parents' wedding quilt. And that quilt is made, it's a rather unusual colour scheme, is because that's the colour scheme of their camper van. And that quilt lives in their camper van.
Describe your worst quilting experience.
That is without shadow of doubt a finished quilt where I had been convinced by somebody not to pre-wash my fabrics. And I'd used a red fabric in there, and it ran and it wrecked the quilt. There was no coming back. There was absolutely no coming back. So I think it ended up in somebody's dog basket because I didn't want to waste it, but I just didn't want to see it anymore. And I am now an ardent pre-washer. If you look back at the flying geese quilt, the red fabric there, that was washed 5 times. And then I used the fixer, Synthathrol, I think it's called. I used that, and then I washed it again. It still ran, used it again, and it stopped running. If I had not washed it, I dread to think what would have happened.
Yeah.
How I pre-wash is I put all the fabrics, my pieces, into a large old pillow slip, tie it up with a piece of string, and put the whole thing in the washing machine. So the fluff's not going to come out and block the filters on my washing machine. I know people who've washed jelly rolls and they've basically ended up with a bundle of thread. When the pieces get to a certain width, you can't really wash them satisfactorily. But most scrap fabric that I get is big enough pieces to be able to just shove in a pillowcase and wash. And then I'll iron and starch them.
We all have the same amount of time, and there are so many things we can do. What makes you keep making quilts rather than doing anything else you might want to do?
It's the teaching that I do more than anything else. But at the moment, I'm making memory quilts for a friend whose baby has died. And she wanted small memory quilts for her other children and for herself. I have found that excruciating because I've known her for a very long time. She came in one day last week and we were looking at what I'd done so far, and to see what that means to her and the comfort that will bring her and her children that has to be worth it. You can't put a price on that. I made a quilt for my niece, for Rory one, from my mother-in-law's old shirts. When she died, I'm afraid I was a bit callous. I raided her wardrobe and took a lot of her shirts, and I made this quilt for Rory. And again, it took me a long time, and I found it very painful to be chopping up my mother-in-law's beautiful shirts. But they're now where they need to be because they're now doing another job. If they'd been shoved in a bag and gone off to the charity shop or Goodwill, they'd have been worn by somebody else and loved by somebody else, but they would have been no good to the family. Whereas they are now of use in the family. And I think that is often overlooked. And I often say to people in my classes, if your stitches are wobbly or your points don't quite match, it doesn't matter. You still stitch with the same amount of love and with the same amount of care. It's the comfort that you can give with these quilts that counts, I think. Particularly I tend to make quilts for people when they hit 40, as well as when they're born. And they are very amazingly well received, actually, because they realise that a lot of effort has gone into them and it's not something you can buy. I know my great niece, Miffy, and her brother, Stefan, went with their dad to America last year, and they saw lots of quilts, the Amish quilts. She found one not dissimilar to the blue flying geese one that you've got there. And she said to me she couldn't believe how much it cost. And I said, well, that's because of the amount of time it takes to make them. And her dad said to me he had never realised. But they do now.
Their appreciation just went up 100%.
I think so. The other thing that I've done is I've made, talking of recycling fabrics, in the Lockdown Patchwork Project list of patterns that we've got, I've written a pattern for a table runner, which I actually made for my sister, and I backed with a section of tablecloth. It was from an old damask tablecloth that used to belong to my grandfather, who rejoiced in the name of Harold Tudor Barker, and he was a silk and lace importer, and he always had these beautiful damask tablecloths. And they've been sitting in the cupboard for years. Nobody was using them. So not only have I used it to back the table runner for my sister, but I've also used it to back the quilt that I made when I was learning to ruler quilt with Angie Atwood. So that it's all family history stitched in and used. There's 3 different colours of damask tablecloth in the back of my quilt, and it doesn't matter a jot.
It's so wonderful that you can have that to look at rather than it just being folded up and put away where you're not seeing it at all.
Absolutely right. Better it have a job. I think my sister likes the back of the table runner better than the front.
Share a quilting tip.
Always pre-wash your fabric. Don't just put your fabric in the washing machine. Put it into a bag, tie that bag up and wash it. And if the fabric runs and you have any doubts about it, do not use it. Most modern fabrics won't run, but occasionally you get an absolute stinker. When you think about the hours that you put into stitching and cutting and planning, why waste your life with a fabric that you know is going to wreck everything else? It's not worth it.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I wanted to say was that quilting has introduced me to so many things that I would not have otherwise done. I've been interviewed on the radio twice for Radio Northampton. We arranged a fabric sale here. I got in a right panic about it because I've invited all these people to come and have stalls. We've got lots of people who've made cakes. I borrowed the church and the village hall. And I went out of the door on the morning of that show. Everybody was set up. The show was opening at 12. And at 11 o'clock, I went out of the church just to go over to the village hall to check everything was going okay. And the village was so silent. I mean, the population of this village is 600. I could hear the combine harvesters in the fields working. It was that quiet. There was no traffic, no noise. And I went back into the church and thinking, this is going to be a disaster. How am I going to explain to all these people that I have messed up? Then the phone rang. It was a friend of mine who said, I'm coming up from London. I've come to support you. Can you pick me up from the railway station, which is 5 miles away? So I said, yeah, no problem. I'll get my car and I'll drive down and pick you up. I walked out of the church and the village was at a complete standstill. 600 people had turned up. So we had doubled the population of the village. And we sold out of cake very quickly. Somebody had to go and buy some more from elsewhere. We actually shut the show, which was supposed to shut at 4. We shut at 2:30 because they were sold out. At the end of the cashing up, I was thinking, if we've made £500, I can send to the Royal Marsden Cancer Fund, which was very dear to my heart because my brother-in-law was being treated for prostate cancer at the time. I thought, if we can make 500 quid, I'll be happy. We sent over £1,700 to the Royal Marsden from that one fabric sale. A lot of people had donated fabrics that we bundled up and sold. That absolutely flew. And it was an utterly, utterly exhausting experience. We had to change venue at the last minute because we were going to be in the sports pavilion and have pergolas out. But then the weather forecast was appalling, so we moved to the village hall and the church. But that was such an amazing experience. And to be able to, off the back of selling fabrics and threads, a lot of people had a great time out. We shifted a lot of books, old patterns, vintage fabrics. We sold a huge amount of cake. And we were then able to send all that money to the Royal Marsden Cancer Fund.
How remarkable.
And it was not a one-man show. There was so many people in this village helped. It was just incredible. Everybody I asked just said yes. And I think we all thought it was going to be a nice, gentle afternoon. It was absolutely manic. But we did raise a lot of money, so it was worth it.
Yeah. It just takes so much time to put that all together and see it come together, especially if you hadn't done it before. You didn't know what you were going to expect.
We had no idea what numbers to expect at all. We did a smaller version of that last year, much, much, much smaller version. And we just had 2 retailers come into the cricket pavilion. I cleaned out the changing rooms and they each had a changing room, which made up to a beautiful shop. And we had lots of people. It wasn't as busy as the previous show. We raised less money, but it was a much more civilized affair. And people came and they stayed. They didn't come in, go round and go. People were staying for a long time. And that also gave us a chance to exhibit some of the quilts that we make for our local hospital. We've got a little group called East Haddon Wombles. And we make quilts for Daventry Hospital to add a bit of colour, a bit of life to their lives.
Yeah. Charities are near and dear to my heart, so I love that you're doing that. Describe how you went from having quilting as a hobby and it became a business for you.
My sewing classes are the business side of it. And people come into the classes wanting to learn to quilt. We also have sold a few patterns through the Lockdown Patchwork Project, and we've put that money into a fund. And Alison, before she was poorly, got together a whole band of people in France using the money that we had raised by selling quilt patterns. She got a whole load of quilts, blue and yellow quilts, made for Ukrainian refugees that were living in France. That is such a group effort, very much conducted by Alison. I can't remember the number of quilts they made, but it was substantial. And that was a really good use of the money that we had raised by selling those patterns, so that these people who had come with nothing actually had something. Having said that, I also made 4 quilts because my sister was involved with helping a family who'd come in from Ukraine at the beginning of the war. The father had been killed, and the young mother had a young son, I think he was about 7, and a daughter of 3. They also managed to get her aunt out. And I had great delight in making them quilts. Not of blue and yellow, but somebody dumped a glorious bag of scrap fabric on my doorstep. So I just made 4 quilts for them, knowing that they had got something that had been made for them alone. It wasn't being done as part of a charitable thing. It was done as a gift. That made a big impact on them, but their reaction made a bigger impact on me.
Mm-hmm. You teach sewing classes. Does that part of your business have a name?
Yeah, my sewing classes go under the heading of East Haddon in Stitches. Not particularly original, I know, but it was all I could think of at the time. I've got people who come to my classes who've been coming since the beginning, which is 10 years now. I've been doing the classes. And I've got people who've come to my classes, gone away, come back after a gap. I've got people who are new, just a general mix. But the main thing that I see is the therapy side, which might sound a bit off-putting, but it's not meant to be. When you get people coming in and they're stressed or anxious or they've got too much on their plate, and they sit down with their sewing, and they may not start sewing, and I stick a cup of tea in front of them because I make the tea, I look after everybody. And for some people, it's the only time of the week where somebody else makes them a drink. And the impact of that on them can be quite profound. And last week, I had 5 different people in the different classes, because I did 4 last week, each say, as they were leaving, "Oh, I feel so much better now. I'm so glad I came." That's what it's all about. And yes, I can teach them to sew, and I can keep their sewing machines serviced for them so that they keep them defluffed, and I can point out the errors that I can't fix on their sewing machines. And we have a scrap bag. We also have a box of patterns, which people have donated over the years. So we must have thousands of pounds worth of dress and clothing patterns that people can dip into, use, put back when they've finished, or keep them if they want to. I supply haberdashery at a decent price, because sometimes if you go into the stores, it's ridiculously expensive now. It's a joyful thing. The classes are joyful. And friendships are made, problems are solved. And invariably, if somebody comes in saying, "Oh, has anybody got a telephone number for somebody in the social services because I've got a problem with X, Y, or Z," somebody will go, "Yeah, you need to speak to so-and-so. Here's their direct number." And all sorts of little incidents like that make a massive difference to individuals' lives, but also people feel part of a group where they know they are welcome, understood. Nobody's going to criticize them. They know if they've got stuck, they'll get help. They'll get as much help as they need. And that's what it's all about for me. Adding value to people's lives, whether it's through providing them with scrap fabric, mending their sewing machine. And quite regularly, I get given older sewing machines, and I can always find a home for them. So it stops things being wasted. And it's better that a sewing machine is recycled and sent to a new home where it's going to be used and loved, than it sits in the bottom of somebody's wardrobe and does nothing.
Exactly. But you talk quite a bit about the Lockdown Patchwork Project. And it's continuing, correct?
Yes. We get people joining us all the time. It just seems to be keeping going. And because we've got such a large collection of block instructions now written, in the files section of the Lockdown Patchwork Project, we have got, I think, 138 entries. Of that, I would say 130 of those are block instructions. And they start from block 1, which is how to construct a simple 4-patch, get the point in the middle right, and then you can go to the YouTube video on the Lockdown Patchwork Project on YouTube and learn how to spin seams so you get a flatter finish. So you've got all of that going on. And then you've got the more advanced blocks. So if you look at block 88, which we didn't realise had only ever been done before as a paper piece block, I actually wrote the instructions for it. And twice we've had huge numbers of people join just to get access to the instructions for block 88. I'm very proud of block 88, actually, because it was very hard to do. And I made 2 versions. The first one I made ended up in the bin because I thought those instructions just won't work. Then I made a second one which did work, but I hadn't got the points exactly right. And then I've got to do the third one, by which time I tweaked the instructions. I then sent the instructions through to Alison. She proofread them for me, picked up spelling mistakes, made sure everything worked. And then we published from there on. But there's all sorts of instructions in there. There's also instructions on how to make a zippy bag. We've got 2 table runner designs, might be 3 now, a scissor holder, various other bits and pieces that people can use. There's one block, which is little Christmas trees, which makes up into a cushion cover for Christmas. It's all there. And how you work out which, because trying to index anything on Facebook is nigh on impossible because they keep moving everything around. But what we created, this I have to say was Alison's idea, was you have albums. So we have a section in albums called Block 1, and in there will be photographs of everybody's Block 1s. If you then go over to Block 1 in files, that will give you the instructions. So if you look at block 88 in albums, it will show you all the versions that people have made of block 88. But then if you go back into files, you will find all the instructions on how to actually cut and stitch that block. We've also got in guides at the top of the feed on the Facebook page, we've got some useful information in guide 1, and in guide 2 are all the instalments for Scrappy Confetti. That sits there the whole time. We're not withdrawing that. That's freely available to anybody who wants it. And I know that works. It just works. But in the guide 1, we've got a copy of the article I wrote about the importance of mastering the scant 1/4 inch seam and various other bits and pieces like that. That's all in there. So there's a lot of information in there. All the time we aim at beginners, although Scrappy Jewel was Alison's design and I wrote it, and that has got quite a big following now, that pattern. But we've withdrawn that one, and in due course it will be reissued as a to-buy pattern because it's extremely complicated to make.
It's beautiful. It's no wonder that people love that one.
It is beautiful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to touch a little bit more on how your business helps with mental health.
This is dear to my heart. This is so dear to my heart. It's just the fact that people who maybe otherwise wouldn't get out, they come to a sewing class. It doesn't matter actually whether it's a sewing class or a book club or whatever it is, but as far as I'm concerned, a sewing class is a place where people come in and they leave behind all the daily stuff. Because if you're doing something, a complicated bit of stitching, you can't actually concentrate on anything else. You've got to concentrate on what you're doing. Otherwise, it will go wrong. And to see how people come in burdened with their daily life, whether they're dealing with a poorly husband, a sick dog, grandchildren that they find hard work to look after, but they have to because their children are at work. All these sorts of issues get left behind. Physical illnesses, obviously physical illnesses carry a mental burden as well. And to find that people have stitched their way out of that big black hole that they were in, or even a grey hole for that matter, and then they end up being proud of what they've made. And they feel better about themselves. They've got something useful they can give or keep. It's just so important, but incredibly simple. In so many ways, it's very simple. For me personally, when I'm at home and I'm not doing sewing work for customers, I find being at my sewing machine, it's my space, my time. What I'm making is what I'm making. It's my rules. If I don't quite follow what otherwise the quilt police would throw at us, if it works, I don't care. And I say exactly the same in my classes. I say the same on the Facebook pages. If it works for you, do it. Because sewing is not a competition. I will never, I promise, I will never put a quilt of mine into a competition, because that's not what I'm about. It's about making something beautiful. Doing an exhibition is one thing. That's not what I'm talking about. But it's when it gets all competitive and you get people who are judging these quilts who don't necessarily know what they're talking about. That absolutely infuriates me. But to share a skill that you have learned the hard way by making lots of mistakes, lots of unpicking, lots of times when you've laughed at yourself and thought, how on earth did I manage to do that so badly? And then you've still ended up with a finished, usable quilt top that somebody is going to love. That for me is why I do what I do. The reality is, if you've made a few mistakes in your quilt top and maybe a few points don't quite match up and you've got a wobbly stitch here, or you've missed a bit of stitching and had to go back and hand stitch it yourself to finish it off properly, and your quilting's got a bit of a wobble in it, will that make your quilt less loved, less useful, less functional? I don't think so. A quilt is a piece of furnishing to be used and loved. And I said to everybody I give a quilt to, when it's worn out or gets a hole in it, send it back, I'll mend it and send it back to you. And that for me is what quilting is all about, which brings us back to using scrap fabrics, doesn't it? And scrap fabrics, if you see how much gets wasted, I've now got a group of ladies who may previously have put fabric in the bin, but they won't. They'll hang on to it now. And then somebody else in the class will say, oh, has anybody got a piece of orange and brown striped whatever? And somebody will say, I've got some left over from whatever they were doing. Here you are. And just hand it on. And I always say to people, always remember that piece of scrap fabric cost the same amount per metre as the bit that was originally used. If you throw fabric in the bin, you might as well put money in the bin.
Yep. Sarah, was there anything else you wanted to share today?
I have met so many people through quilting and sewing generally that I would perhaps never have met. I've made friendships that I would never have experienced. I've made friends with people from all over the world through the Lockdown Patchwork Project. And for me, that's such a privilege. And when people come to this country on a holiday, on a trip, and they contact me and say, we'd love to meet you. That is such an honour that they feel they want to come and spend a bit of time with me. I do feel very honoured by the gift that quilting and sewing keeps giving, because it doesn't matter what quilt show you go to, you'll always find somebody to talk to. You'll find people who are like-minded. I quite often meet my friend Stacey at quilt shows, and we'll have a good old natter about life, and we'll go around and look at fabrics, and we've got completely different tastes in fabrics, and that's what fascinates me, because what I like will not be what you like. That doesn't make it right or wrong. It makes it personal. If I make somebody a present from some fabric that I bought at a quilt show in, say, Newmarket, I can actually tell them that this fabric came from this couple who have their fabrics printed in Germany, and this is what I bought it for, and I have made you a pot holder out of it that they will use every day. To see that connection and to be able to talk to so many people who've got so many different skills. And quite often you'll come across stall holders who don't actually quilt. I would get very excited about something or other they've got on their stall, and you can see them thinking they don't know why it's so exciting. But the last thing I found was a minute pair of scissors. They're probably 2 inches long, and they are fantastic for snipping threads when you're burying threads in a quilt. They were £1, I think. They were really, really cheap, but they are brilliant for that job. I can remember I was with Stacey at the time, and she laughed at me and she said, what are you going to do with those? And I use them all the time. A pair of cheap little scissors. And the quilt shows, you get ideas from other people's work. And I love the exhibitions. I don't like the competition side of it, but I like the exhibitions where you get see people's work and people's ideas and see the joy that quilting gives people. Whether it's a table runner, a placemat, a quilt, a pot holder, it doesn't matter what it is. And if you've used scrap fabric to make these items, then you've saved that fabric from going down the hole in the ground.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing I have here is, where can we find you?
The Lockdown Patchwork Project is on Facebook. It's a closed group, and we keep it closed, as I said before, to keep the trolls out. I'm just about to do a video to explain to people how to find everything in the group, because I'm amazed at how many people have got no idea how to look around on the Facebook groups. The East Haddon in Stitches is probably only useful for people who are within 25 miles of East Haddon, because that's where I post notices of all my classes, whether it's my classes or Angie Atwood coming to do ruler classes or our special classes that we're going to do. We've got a craft day coming up. We're calling it Christmas in July because we're having a workshop where we're going to be making reusable Christmas crackers. So we're getting them done early. And you can also find us on YouTube. It's the Lockdown Patchwork Project. Don't forget the at the beginning. When you get into that group, click on videos and then you'll see all the videos that we've done there. There's not a huge amount because I don't make that many, but the ones that are there are worth having. There's things like how to make a zippy bag. There's 2 zippy bag ones. How to put a zip in a cushion. So when you've made your patchwork cushion front and you want to make a zipped cushion, there is a detailed video which shows you how to put a zip in a cushion. I had one lady come to class who could not master how to put a zip in a cushion. Very clever lady, very competent sewer, but a zip in a cushion just completely defeated her. So I came up with this idea and I use it in all my classes now. It never fails. It never fails. There's some information about spinning seams on a single block and then on multiple blocks when you've got multiple seams. There's a video on how to join blocks using sashing, so Quilt as you go, and various other bits and pieces like that. There's some more videos coming up. Now I've actually found out how to do them on my own, because previously they were done with a lot of help from my niece, Susanna, who's now gone to university and she's now about to go to Mexico for a year. So I'm on my own in that regard. So that's where you find us. If anybody wants to join the Lockdown Patchwork Project and have access to scrappy confetti, they'll find it in guides. If they can't find it, just put a message into the group and either Alison, Jenny, or I will pick up your message and answer you. We always answer queries. We always have answered queries. And we just want to make the whole hobby, whole skill accessible to everybody who wants to do it.
Well, thank you so much for all you do for everyone. These projects are so important.
Well, thank you very much. It's been very interesting talking to you.
Well, Sara, thanks again for being on A Quilter's Life. I loved hearing your story.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye. You can find more stories on aquilterslife.com or subscribe on your favorite podcast player so each episode will be downloaded automatically. Also, I want to hear about you and your wonderful quilts. Please contact me, Paula Chamberlain, through the website to set up an interview. And as always, thanks for listening.